Welcome, class, to Bubbles, Panics, and Depressions, a world history of economic crisis. This is week 9. Week 9 brings us right into the midst of the Great Depression, this worldwide crisis of unprecedented proportions. And it also introduces us to some new concepts in the world economy, and that's one of those is the role of the central banker. Especially in Europe and the United States, the central banker becomes very important to the way economies are run, to the issue of whether or not to stimulate an economy or how to handle currency and interest rates. These are simple things, but they're very important things. So in Europe and the United States, you have four central bankers. You have Benjamin Strong, Emile Moreau, strong as U.S. Emile Moreau for France, Norman Montague for England, and then Hjalmar Schacht for Germany. And these four guys are really important to the workings of the interwar economy. Uh, so, uh, Benjamin Strong. This guy's a really smart guy. He runs the New York Federal Reserve, which essentially dictates economic policy in the 1920s. But he's sick. He's got tuberculosis, and it will end up being a deadly disease for him. The other bankers listen to him, and in the early 20s, I think he's a voice of reason and somebody who says that, we need to work collaboratively to solve economic problems. But by the end of the 1920s, he's really out of the picture, and not really by accident. You see that this is the time when the world economy begins to spin out of control and the American economy begins to spin out of control. Uh, Norman Montague, he's a proper British gentleman, but he's also a bit of a he's got anxiety, and whenever things really get tough, he stays home from work and he goes to bed. So he's got some kind of imagined, diseases that he cooks up whenever things really get tough. And of course, it's a terrible time to be a central banker because the world economy is falling apart. Emile Moreau is a very effective bureaucrat, and he actually does a pretty good job with the French economy. The French have an advantage because they have more gold reserves at the end of World War II than any other European nation. They're still in pretty good shape economically. They have lots of inflation, but they're able to manage this inflation by reinflating their whole economy and getting some foreign investment in the French economy, and that really buoys up the French economy for much of the 1920s. And of course, we talked about Hjalmar Schacht last time. Schacht is the one who had the idea to create a new currency in Germany and really got rid of the hyperinflation. The German economy is able to restabilize itself for about 5 years, about 4 years, and then in 1929 and 1930, then they suffer because the other European economies and the United States economy is beginning to suffer. And really, it's the German and the U.S. economies that go down into the Great Depression at about the same time, and then and really the British are in a recession by 1928. They have high unemployment for much of the 1920s. We'll talk about that in a minute. The French, as I said, are in a better situation. Okay, let me talk for a moment. So they're interesting characters, and they're very important to the world economy. As central bankers today are very important to the world economy. But this is really the first time period when we see this, that these guys they don't work for the federal government, most of them. They work for banks that are associated with the federal government, uh, and uh, and they can pull strings which make economies work or not work. Okay, one other thing before we get into details: inflation, deflation. Right? Why is this so important? because most Europeans and many in the United States believed that the gold standard was just that. It was the standard that you needed to stay on, and if you couldn't stay on it, you needed to get back to it as soon as possible. And the way you got to the gold standard is by high interest rates that reduced prices, that deflated prices, and thereby increased the value of your currency. And then you could go back and get your currency to a high enough value that you could actually go back on the gold standard. Okay, so it's not that complicated, uh, and we talked about this earlier, but there is that difference between inflation and deflation. And there were those, of course, who believed the opposite, that you should uh, use inflation to to stimulate the economy and get the economy moving. But there really weren't that many. There are many more in today's world than there were in the 1920s who believe that you need some inflation to stimulate an economy, and you do not want to have a kind of a stagnant or a flat economy like the Japanese economy in the 1990s. That's not good. You don't want that. And that's essentially what happens to the British in the 1920s. Okay, so let's talk about the British. After World War I, the central bankers, including Montagu, believed that the British have to get back on the gold standard to get back to where they were before World War I, to be a world economic leader like they were, to establish a kind of standard for the British sterling. Uh, they they believe that the only way to do this is to get back to the gold standard, and so the central bank, the Bank of England, pursues a deliberate policy of deflating prices after the war. And they do this by raising interest rates. Their interest rates in the 1920s are upwards of 5%, and in some cases up to 8%. What it means is that, in fact, the currency will rise in value because everything else is going down in value. But when you deflate prices, if you're not careful, you're going to deflate the entire economy. And this is what happens in England. Unemployment goes up because there's less money out there to stimulate manufacturing, less money for people to buy goods. Although goods are cheaper, it the deflation actually makes it much more difficult to get access to money to buy goods, to manufacture goods. So unemployment stays at about 10% in England for much of the decade. And the economy goes into a recession by the late 1920s, before the American and the German Great Depression. So the British pursue a policy that by this time it's really a 19th century policy, and this is the 20th century. And so they get caught in the lure of the gold standard, and really damage their economy for a decade because they're pursuing this kind of the uh, gold. They're pursuing that gold standard, which is probably the wrong decision in the 1920s. Okay, let's and just a little bit on the French. The French economy is well run. They have more gold than any other European power, and so they have inflation. Inflation is an issue, but they get other nations to buy into their economy in the mid 1920s, and so they can they have inflation, but they have enough economic productivity and prosperity that they're able to work their way through that inflation. Okay, let's talk about the American economy, which is, of course, the most important economy in the Atlantic world in the 1920s. It's the one successful economy. And remember, this is the economy that is floating the debt and the reparations payments of Europe. Because remember, you have those debt payments going uh, from the debt payments going from the British and the French to the United States. But before that happens, you have reparations that are paid from the Germans to the French and the British. And the way that the Germans can make these payments, in some cases, is by direct payments from the United States to the Germans. So you basically have money circulating from the United States, going to Germany, going to France and Britain, and then coming back to the United States. Uh, where's the money in that economy? It's American money and only American money. That's a dangerous way to do an economy because it works as long as the American economy has lots of money. But when the American economy no longer has lots of money, then you're in big trouble. And this is what happens in 1929 with the crash of the American stock market. Okay, now the American economy is very successful after World War I. This is an economic boom. Prices for workers go up by 20, 30% in this time period. The stock market triples in this time period. Americans begin to get household goods like electrification, like appliances, like refrigerators and washers and dryers, these kinds of things. Americans can actually buy homes on credit. Mortgages become available for the first time. Uh, the equivalent of a credit card, you can actually get an account or a line of credit through banks and buy appliances or other things on credit. So this is an economy that's very successful in the 1920s. Not all parts. Farmers are suffering low crop prices after World War One, and they're struggling throughout the decade, so not everybody is prosperous. But overall, the economy is very good. Now, 1927, this economy is booming, the stock market is up, and the Federal Reserve of New York does what? It lowers interest rates. Now, why would they do that? They did that because the British were having a terrible time, and the British said to the Americans, look, help us out, lower interest rates to stimulate economic activity. Well, you have to ask the question, why didn't the British lower their own interest rates? Because they wanted to get back to the gold standard. So they're trying to get the Americans to do their dirty work. And sure enough, the Americans bought into it. The problem for that is that produced more economic stimulus, and it produced a bubble. It produced a stock market bubble. Because there was so much money available that lots of people invested in the stock market. So between 1927 and 1929, the stock market doubled, and there was definitely a stock market bubble at that point. Americans didn't realize it, but there was. Part of the problem is the way that money was invested in the stock market. Americans could actually invest money in the stock market using 10% of their own money and then 90% of borrowed money, called money buying on margin. And this was a great thing to do when the stock market was going up. There was no problem with this. But once the stock market begins to decline, if you buy on margin, and the problem is that once the stock price declines below 10%, then you've lost all your money. Now you're using borrowed money and you're beginning to lose borrowed money, and you actually have to pay that borrowed money back with very high interest rates. This is called call money. And during the spring 1929 stock market crisis, call money was at about 20%. So this is a big problem. So you have buying on margin. You also have the operation of stock market pools. And these were wealthy individuals who actually would buy into the stock market and also buy good press on a stock. And they would get together actually and do this in collaboration. And then they would buy up the stock. Then the stock price would run up. Other people would begin to buy, and they would sell the stock. And now other people were buying a stock that was ready to collapse. The wealthy people made a lot of money in this, but average people who didn't have good stock advice or were just reading newspapers to get their stock information suffered tremendous losses, and this made for tremendous volatility in the stock market. And so the other part of this, the last part of the stock market crash, is that structurally the American economy was oriented towards wealthy people. And there were, as I said before, there were sectors that weren't doing well. Mining was another sector where miners were very poorly paid, and their work was very dangerous. And so poor people really didn't benefit much from this this booming economy in the 1920s. So stock market begins to decline. Some wealthy people like William Durant, who had founded General Motors, believe that they have so much economic power they can save the stock market single-handedly. So they actually go into the stock market and put all of their money in there. William Durant lost all of his money. He died in 1938, a destitute man. He was running a pool hall in Flint, Michigan, and he had, a pair of shoes, an overcoat. That was basically it. This is a guy who had been one of the wealthiest people in the world. So one of the things about the Great Depression is it didn't distinguish between wealth and poverty. Both wealthy people and impoverished people suffered greatly in the Great Depression. Okay, so the stock market crashes. Overnight, money disappears. The Americans can no longer afford to support the European economy, to support German reparations and war debts and the rest of it. And so this has this terrible knock-on effect that the European economy now begins to suffer greatly. The German economy goes down into depression as well. What does the Federal Reserve of New York do? Now, Benjamin Strong is gone by this time. So that voice of reason is gone. So the Federal Reserve raises interest rates initially, the New York Federal Reserve. And they raise interest rates up to 6% in that early period. For just a few months, you can check the charts on Blackboard. But in that few months, that really dampens any chance of economic growth or economic recovery. Eventually, they bring interest rates back down, but by then it's too late. So timing is really important here. And so the American economy slips into a depression. In 1931, there's a bank run. Banks begin to fail because there's no money, and Americans are losing money, and the banks are losing money. And so bank failures happen. Of course, people run to the bank to take the money out, and that produces more bank failures. This is a very bad situation. The federal government reacts too little, too late. They put some money, $500 million, into the economy. It's not nearly enough. And they also get the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. But the problem is that the American economy, and you can check this in the charts as well, the American economy is in a major deflation now. Prices are collapsing. Manufacturing collapses. It goes down by about 50%. Unemployment shoots up to about 25%. In the major cities, unemployment is much higher. In a big city like Detroit, that was so dependent upon the automobile industry, unemployment is as high as 80% in the winter of 1932-33. Now, Franklin Roosevelt steps into this. He is elected president in 1932 and then takes office in early 1933. And in February 1933, just before he is to take office, there's another bank run. And it looks like the economy could really collapse. Roosevelt takes power and very quickly announces a bank holiday, which is actually the banks just lock their doors, and the bankers, they go home, and you just keep the bank shut so people can't run and take money out. But the other thing is Roosevelt puts in place a series of laws that actually change the banking part of this very quickly. He institutes the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guarantees the money that you have in banks. You don't have to run to the bank and pull your money out. Federal Deposit Insurance now is a reality, and we have that today. So this helps. This basically stops the bank runs, and lots of other economic stimulus. His first 100 days, he passes all kinds of legislation, which is crucial to the recovery of the American economy. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, some of it's declared unconstitutional. But as a package, it reinflates the American economy. Now, what does he do in terms of prices and currency? Roosevelt decides in 1933 that he needs to reinflate prices. Prices have collapsed, so things are cheap, but no one can afford them because no one has any money or has a job. So Roosevelt decides to go partially off the gold standard, prints lots of money, and then loosens the money, the remaining money that is still on the gold standard to just a percentage of what it was previously. So this has the effect of reinflating the American economy to a certain extent, and by 1935, really, and early 1936, the American economy is on the mend. Roosevelt runs for re-election in 1936, and then makes the mistake of running on a balanced budget platform. Because Roosevelt is, he's this old line aristocrat, and he believes you have to have a balanced budget. So he runs on this, wins the election, and then institutes budget cuts. He pulls money out of the economy, and sure enough, by the spring of 1937, the economy goes into a tailspin. It's called the the Roosevelt recession, because it was essentially caused by Roosevelt's actions in cutting the budget. Okay, so the American economy really doesn't recover until 1939. It's a 10-year time period when unemployment is very high and economic activity is very low. So this is a really serious economic collapse. The German economy recovers more quickly because Hitler comes to power. He's elected chancellor in 1932, and he reinflates the economy there. Spends lots of money on military hardware and gets everybody employed in manufacturing or in the army. The British economy begins to recover as well because the British do decide belatedly to go off the gold standard. The French economy doesn't suffer quite so much. And so you have a kind of a series of recoveries in the 1930s. But it takes the whole decade for the major European and the American economy to recover. Do consult the graphs and the charts that I've put on Blackboard. Those will help you to understand kind of the individual statistics. The other thing that happens is that trade walls go up. The Americans, in my opinion, make a huge mistake by putting up trade barriers in 1930 in the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, and then the rest of the world really follows suit. The Europeans put up trade barriers, and so what you have is economic islands by the mid 1930s. International trade is really like cut in half, in some cases less, more than half. And so you have, I think you have the seeds of economic nationalism and political and cultural nationalism, which eventually leads to World War II. Now, let me turn very briefly to East Asia. We talk about Japan. Japan's economy goes into recession in 1926. So it's happening quite early, actually. Their problem is that in the post-war period, they don't have enough markets for their goods, and they've never had that much capital, and so their businesses are struggling, and their unemployment rate is quite high. By the early 1930s, politicians associated with the military take over in Japan, and the Japanese economy begins to expand through forceful military expansion onto the mainland of Asia. They invade Manchuria in 1931. They invade Johor in 1932-33. And they're just expanding southward throughout the 1930s. By 1937, they're in a full-scale war against the Chinese. And so the Japanese economy in the 1930s is really based upon military expansion to gain access to resources, and then back home, military manufacturing to boost up the economy. And so the Japanese actually recover quite quickly from the Great Depression, and they do this through forceful military expansion, basically the same way the Germans recovered. They're going to expand through military means to help their economy and to become an empire, actually. Okay, so the rest of Asia, not much capital, economic crisis there. China, Southeast Asia, Korea. This is true for all of these places. That there's not a tremendous amount of economic activity, there's political instability, and there's warfare. So this is a very tough time period for that part of the world. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll talk again next week.